It was a scene never to be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Tragedy involving children is always particularly heartbreaking. It was billed as the greatest treat for children ever given.
Hundreds of children would descend on the Victoria Hall in Sunderland for an afternoon performance of what should have been a feast of entertainment, magic, and wonderment. Instead, it was to end by taking the lives of 183 children on a warm June day in 1883. Many more would be injured and hundreds would be left badly traumatized in what was to be advertised as the greatest treat for children ever given. That afternoon would end with an horrific death toll in unimaginable circumstances. The tragedy of innocent lives lost would ricochet around the town, and soon the country and the world. A simple swing door bolted to the floor, leaving enough room for one child at a time to pass through, would not only be a factor in the deaths, but the question would be, who exactly bolted it?
When did you bolt that door? Any amount of witnesses say they saw you.
I did not bolt it.
When I approached the lower door, I heard some fearful screams.
There is not the slightest occasion for such a closely boarded door. It is more like the door of a police cell.
Sunderland, a town situated on the northeast coast of the UK, has seen its fair share of tragic moments throughout its history, and 1831 would bring another measure of destruction of human life to its shores. The first incidents of cholera in England occurred in Sunderland on October 1831, when a ship carrying sailors who had the disease docked at the port. The ship was allowed to dock because the port authorities objected to, and therefore ignored, instructions from the government to quarantine all ships coming from the Baltic states. From Sunderland, the disease made its way northwards into Scotland and southwards toward London. It later spread throughout the entire British Isles, killing a total of 32,000 people. 215 perished in Sunderland. From its point of origin in Bengal, it took 5 years to cross Europe, so that by the time it reached Sunderland, British doctors were well aware of what cholera did. No one knew how to prevent the development or spread of cholera because the discovery of germs, which are the cause of cholera, did not happen until 1864. Sunderland was to see another tragedy of equal measure in 1883. This time it would shake the town and the nation to its core. 183 children would perish in a tragedy that should never have happened. In 1856, a building fund was formed to build the Victoria Hall. However, it would be a further 16 years before it would open its doors. The Victoria Hall was built in 1872, designed by Darlington architect George Gordon Hoskins. His original design included a clock tower, but this was never built, and the building was to be extended in the early years of the next century. Hoskins had designed a number of buildings for the Backhouse family, one of the backers of the new hall. At the time, more affluent areas were developing around Fawcett Street, and in 1870, after seeing a need for a new public hall, the site was chosen and the Backhouse family funded the building. It was ideal in which stage meetings could be held, along with other entertainments. The Victoria Hall was a large and imposing brick building built in a Gothic style that was very fashionable at the time. It would be described by latter-day historians as a large Gothic monstrosity. It was built to mimic the Albert Hall and Crystal Palace in both size and architectural style. Inside, the seating capacity was 3,000 and was spread across 3 levels: the ground floor, dress circle, and gallery. 2 staircases gave access to the upper floors, a main staircase to the east, and one to the west, which was referred to as a relief staircase and generally not used. The size of the building meant it was indeed perfect for public meetings and entertainments, although there are few records of the meetings and events that took place in the first 10 years of the Hall's life. At a cost of £6,500, the Victoria Hall, built on a slip of land, had a prominent location across from Mowbray Park and stood on the corner of Toward Road, also known as Park Terrace, and Laura Street on the east side of the park, Laura Street running behind. It looked as though money or time had ran out because, although the south gable wall was partly hidden by the end of a terrace of houses which it adjoined, the north gable plain brick wall was thought to be a very visible eyesore. On Saturday, the 16th of June 1883, the Victoria Hall was offering an afternoon show presented by a pair of entertainers called the Fays. Alexander Fay was a magician and ventriloquist with a repertoire which included tricks called the enchanted cards, talking waxworks, the desiccated pigeons, and the great illusion together with conjuring tricks. He also had a set of singing and talking automata, large ventriloquist dolls. Annie Fay gave what was called spiritual entertainment, seances and demonstrations of clairvoyance. Playbills of the time describe her act as strange manifestations, most bewildering results, mid-air extravaganzas, and startling phenomena. They toured their act around the country, but in early 1883 settled at the Tynemouth Aquarium for a fairly long run, beginning around April. They had also around that time started offering special children's shows in addition to their normal act. Having shown an interest in the Victoria Hall, they secured a booking and arrived on the morning of Saturday, the 16th of June. The Fays, Alexander and Annie, were accompanied by Mr. Fay's assistant Charles Heseltine. Charles was a young man aged 22. Fay and Heseltine had gone to schools in the area, distributing handbills and tickets through the teachers to promote the performance. Standard tickets were charged at just a penny, and the ticket for the Saturday afternoon show promised the greatest treat for children ever given. The tickets that were issued to the schools were more of an advertising bill, small in size and yellow in colour. The children could bring along one of these tickets, but it could admit any number of children on production of 1 penny each. It would later come to light that none of the schools questioned Fay as to the safety aspect of the children whilst attending the Victoria Hall, something that contributed heavily to what would later unfold. On this glorious warm Saturday, hundreds and hundreds of excited children arrived en masse at the Victoria Hall. Almost all of the town's children were in attendance. Many were unaccompanied. For working-class families, entertainments like this were an affordable way of keeping the kids happy for a couple of hours, and most parents saw no need to sit through it themselves. The lack of adult supervision would soon have serious consequences over the next 3 hours. The doors were opened at around 2:10 p.m. The doors were intended to be opened at exactly 2 p.m., but there was a delay in moving an obstruction behind the door. Some might say this was an omen and strangely similar to what would unfold. The audience packed into the stalls and the gallery. The dress circle, in between the two, was not used because it was the proprietor's policy not to open it for admissions under 6p a person, although on this occasion it would be occupied by a single female and a child. Alexander Fay did want the dress circle opened because he would later comment that he could control the children better, but Frederick Graham, who was the hall's caretaker, wouldn't allow it due to policy. It was estimated that 1,100 children were packed into the gallery alone, and the rest were in the stalls, totaling around 2,000. At exactly 3 p.m. the performance commenced with the Fays entering the stage from the left-hand side. Alexander Fay started the performance.
Welcome, boys and girls, to the Victoria Hall.
The show progressed well enough, although some unruly behavior by a select few children throwing things from the gallery was sorted by someone connected to the hall, but overall the performance passed without incident, except when a few children in the front row became sick, likely as a result of the smoke used in one of the tricks. But other than that, the afternoon had been uneventful. The performance came to an end at 5:10 p.m. The last trick of the show that afternoon was the hat trick, and the moment the children had been waiting for. The magician produced toys from his hat and threw them out into the audience. Of course, from the stage, Mr. Fay could only throw toys to those in the stalls. He announced that those in the gallery would get their presents as they left. With few, if any, adults around to caution patients, a horde of eager children raced to the staircase, eager not to miss out. What followed next was to shock the nation to its core. The stairs leading directly from the gallery led down to a lobby area at the dress circle level. From there, another flight of stairs led down to the ground floor and the exit. On a landing halfway down that flight of stairs, there was a very heavy swing door which was designed to control the flow to the gallery pay gate. It could be fully opened, but it also had a strong bolt connected to the bottom of the door and was fed into the floor, which kept the door ajar, so only one person at a time could leave and no more. According to local architect Frank Cause, it was hung so that it divided the landing in two. It is hinged next the wall furthest from the stairs on pivot hinges, so that it will swing either against the wall on the one side or the wall on the other, describing a full semicircle. There is a bolt at the bottom of the door and two bolt holes in the floor, so arranged that the door can be opened and fastened back against the outer wall, or can be made to stand ajar, with its front edge inwards, with an aperture of 1 foot 10 inches clear. That is sufficient for one to go through at a time, he said. The walls along the stairs and passages prevented them from seeing down into that valley of death. They heard cries, shrieks, wails of anguish. But children know how noisy children can be on such occasions without there being any cause for alarm. And so on they went, cheering, rushing, struggling who should get down first. Who can picture the scene that was being meanwhile enacted down on that fatal landing, down in the dim light, in an atmosphere that had quickly become pungent with the gasping breath of multitudes of dying children? Some idea of the degree of pressure to which the frames of these hapless little ones was subjected may be gathered from the circumstance that the fatal bolt, strong wrought iron though it is, was bent by the force of the impact of the mass piled up behind it. The children were heaped on one another in tears. They struggled desperately, and some in their death agony bit those next to them. Little caps and bonnets, torn and trampled, were lying all over the place. Buttons and fragments of clothing littered the floor. Here lay the little blue ribbon which had tied up some girl's hair. There lay a child's garter. On another spot, the sole of a little boy's boot torn from the uppers, furnishing mute but significant evidence of the violence of the death struggle. The scene that followed who can depict? The caretaker, Frederick Graham, tried to untangle the squirming, shrieking mass, but found the weight too much to lift. He then ran up another staircase and led approximately 600 children to safety by another exit. Eventually, those adults in the hall realized that children were trapped and began to pull them one by one through the narrow gap. The hall, soon after the terrible extent of the disaster became known and realized, was one vast mourning chamber. Mothers fainted, and strong men in their agony wept over the remains of their little ones. It was a scene never to be forgotten by those who witnessed it. There lay the little ones, cold in death. Peaceful and pleasant were many of the faces which but a few minutes before were lit up with expectancy and hope. Over them and beside them, fathers and mothers, sisters and brothers, cried for their loss in heart-piercing tones. The death scene will not be soon forgotten. There, in the stillness of the great hall, men bated their breath and walked on tiptoe as the work of laying out the bodies prior to identification proceeded, arranged in rows in the dress circle and in the area beneath. There were faces pale and damaged, others peaceful and unmarked, as if the last, long sleep had not begun, and many were blackened and disfigured in a manner too horrible to describe. In all of its confusion, there were many cases of mothers and fathers taking their deceased children away from the hall and directly home. This made it difficult to get a precise picture of the death toll that was carried out following the incident. Adding to the confusion, there were many cases of children who were misidentified by parents due to the extent of their injuries, and on discovering their error would bring the children back to the hall. In one particular case, a father took home a little boy by mistake, and after arriving there found it was the body of a neighbour's child. In the meantime, his own boy had been recovered alive and was treated with all the care and skill possible, but he later died. Not the least painful incident was the death, 5 days after the tragedy, of Mr. William Robertson, son of Mr. Robinson, of the Argo Frigate Hotel, Bedford Street, after an illness of about 30 hours' duration. Mr. Robinson was one of those who assisted in carrying the bodies out of the hall on the day of the disaster, and was so shocked at the sight that he never again recovered from it. On the Tuesday following, he took ill and died at midnight on the following day. Following the disaster at the hall, news spread quickly around the town. Utter chaos descended on the area surrounding the hall, with the local constabulary keeping as much control as was possible over the large crowds. Thousands of people gathered in the streets which formed the approach to the hall. By 5:45, news of the disaster had spread in every direction. Without virtually any lines of communication at that time, news of the disaster and its victims had to be communicated by word of mouth to all corners of the town. All in all, 183 children, 114 boys and 69 girls, died in the Victoria Hall disaster. In essence, this was the result of crushing or the trampling that occurred. Furthermore, around 100 children suffered serious injuries. Most of the victims were between the ages of 7 and 10, but 2 were just 3 years old. The mangled bodies, many not recognizable, were laying down in rows for identification. Sadly, more than one family lost all of their children. In due time, a man and his wife anxiously scanned the rows of the dead. The man's face blanched, and without showing any further signs of emotion, pointed to a little figure. "That's one," he said. A few yards later, he pointed again and said, "That's another." Then, as he came to the last child in the row, he lost composure. He burst into loud sobs. "My God!" Queen Victoria was informed of the disaster soon after. Many telegrams were sent and received by the Home Secretary to the Sunderland Mayor. The Queen was kept up to date rigorously, requesting information and updates daily. Sir Henry Ponsonby at Balmoral writes to the Mayor of Sunderland,
"The Queen is terribly shocked at this awful calamity, and her heart bleeds for the many poor bereaved parents. She prays that God may support them. Her Majesty is most anxious to hear how the injured children are."
The Mayor replied as follows.
To Sir Henry Ponsonby, will you express to the Queen my heartfelt thanks for her very kind expression of sympathy? The calamity is almost without a parallel, and the town is deeply affected.
During the funerals, which lasted from the following Tuesday until Friday, all businesses in Sunderland remained closed as a mark of respect. The Mayor of Sunderland, John Wright Wayman, wanted to have the burials of all 183 children together on the same day, but this proved impossible. The burial of the dead began on Tuesday, June the 19th, under a chill and clouded sky, and continued for 3 days, with the interment of over 80 bodies in the 3 cemeteries belonging to the town: Bishop Wearmouth, Mere Knowles and Sunderland, Rye Hope Road. When the burials began, streets leading to the cemeteries were lined with people, a large proportion of who were working men, and in nearly all the factories work was suspended for the day. The Sunderland Echo newspaper would report, "At most of the shipyards and engine works, men ceased work at breakfast time, and in the remaining yards and shops as well as in almost every other kind of employment, a stoppage took place at midday. Most of the shops and other workplaces were partially closed in the morning, and several of the larger schools closed at dinner time." Letters and telegrams expressing sympathy with the parents, mostly members of the poorer classes, had ever since been pouring in, Her Majesty being, as usual, the first to send a message of sincere condolence. And on Monday evening, there was a preliminary meeting in the Sahn Street Wesleyan Chapel to provide assistance for those who needed it, and to commemorate the terrible disaster by the erection of some lasting memorial. Upon learning of the tragedy, Queen Victoria sent messages of condolences to families who had lost children, and the words she had written, "Suffer little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of God," were read out at many of the funerals. The disaster pulled at the heart of the country, and a nationwide collection gathered £5,000, which was used to pay for the funerals of the children, and what was left was added to a fund for a memorial to the dead. The memorial, a statue of a grieving mother holding her dead child, was originally situated in Mowbray Park opposite Victoria Hall, and was later moved to Bishop Wearmouth Cemetery. But after a while it became somewhat worse for wear and succumbed eventually to inevitable vandalism, until in 2002 it underwent a £63,000 restoration and was moved back to Mowbray Park, where it still stands today. Although there was no person or persons directly brought to account for bolting the swing door on that fateful day, there are several indications that point to one particular person, Faye's assistant, 22-year-old Charles Heseltine. Heseltine was the one sent up to the passageway by Faye as the performance was concluding in order to distribute the prizes. It was Heseltine that was identified by several witnesses, including a young boy named Wilson, who stated that he'd seen Heseltine arranging prizes on the stage, and then later he noticed him at the fatal door. It was Heseltine who closed the door with his foot after several boys somehow managed to get 5 prizes. Heseltine's reaction was, "This will never do," and was seen to press his foot on the bolt. Heseltine then went up the stairs, exiting at the dress circle, telling children to leave as there were no more prizes left. Wilson had got to the area first, and the rush had not yet happened, but, with the door bolt left in place to the floor, the flood of children then cascaded down the flight towards that door. Wilson had left the building safely and made his way home. Heseltine was also identified by James Fairley after being recalled by the inquest. Alan Parrish, 10, also identified Heseltine as the man who closed the door to within 18 inches and bolted. Alan Parrish, 10, was the first boy called. Questioned as to who bolted the door, he said he saw a man with black curly hair rake the muck out of the hole with a bit of stick and push the bolt down with his hand. George Howitt, aged 9, was also in the gallery. He left through a door which was open some 18 inches. He watched as a man gave presents away, and then noticed that the door was only a little bit open. George had been sitting on a form with Frank and Emily Morris, but Emily did not survive. Frank fainted, but later regained consciousness. Another survivor, 11-year-old Inez Coe, escaped death indirectly because of her disability. Of course, Inez went down the stairs early to avoid the crush. However, a man at the bottom of the stairs said that she could not leave. She had to wait until the others from upstairs had come down. Once the stampede started, Inez snuggled into the corner and used her crutch as a crash barrier. She then saw a boy fall down and others trip over him, so she squeezed into the corner as bodies piled up around her. Then, after what seemed like a long time as she lay there, she saw a man reaching down who was trying to pull out the dead bodies that surrounded her. Screaming out, "Take me before the dead ones, I'm alive," he managed to pull Inez to safety. On reaching the outside, she fainted, but woke with the help of a bucket of cold water. 2 inquests were held, both of which were reported on by national and local press. At that time, Bishop Wearmouth, south of the river, and Monk Wearmouth, to the north, had separate coroners. Victims lived in both districts. Originally, it was intended that the inquests should be held together, but there were legal problems with one coroner sitting in the district of another. The first inquest at Bishop Wearmouth was held between Monday 2nd of July and Wednesday, the 4th of July 1883, commencing 2 days after the disaster and held at the Palatine Hotel. The Palatine was situated near to the scene of disaster. It was this hotel that the dead and injured were taken to following the tragedy. Questions were asked about all aspects of the entertainment, the responsibilities of the Fays who had hired the hall, the responsibilities of the hall owners, and the sequence of events on the day. Alexander Fay, Frederick Graham, Charles Wybert, manager of Mr. Fay, and Charles Heseltine, assistant to Mr. Fay, were all questioned, as well as some of the children who had survived the disaster.
When did you bolt that door? Any amount of witnesses say they saw you.
I did not bolt it. I put my hand down several times behind it, and I tried to take the children out.
Did you not pull the door there where it was standing?
The door was half closed then. It was very near a foot from being closed. If I had not held it back by the box, it would soon have been shut altogether. If I had been consulted about it, I would not have placed it there. Assuming I gave permission to have such a door there, which I would not, I should have had one 4 feet high. There is not the slightest occasion for such a closely boarded door. It is more like the door of a police cell.
The first mention I had of the accident was Heseltine. He came to the body of the hall. He did not rush. He came slowly and fell on his back on the stairs. He seemed in a fainting condition. I pulled him, but he did not answer, and I then threw some water in his face. He presently came around, and I asked him what was the matter. He said, "Oh dear, there's some of them stuck fast and they are dead." I asked how many, and he mentioned the word dozen. I left him and rushed to the pit entrance. I then saw 2 or 3 men running about, and I noticed 2 or 3 little boys lying on their backs at the pit entrance, and a man with another in his arms. I picked them up. I was very much excited and said to a man, "Are they dead?" He said, "Yes, there are a good many more dead. Run for a doctor."
I first heard that there was something wrong at the hall a minute or 2 before 5 o'clock. A young lady came to my house and said that a little boy was in a fit, or dying, at the hall, and asked if I would go across and attend to him. I hurried across without a moment's delay and entered the gallery and area door.
When I approached the lower door, I heard some fearful screams. There were also groans and noises of struggling. I rushed to the door and attempted to open it, and found I could not do so. The bolt was in the socket, about 2 feet from the door frame. Indeed, the doorway was full up, nearly as high as my head, with the bodies of children. You rushed my way upstairs to another route and came down the stairway crammed with children. When we reached the 4th step from the bottom, we found the children packed in a mass. From that place, also all over, the whole of the landing below, there seemed to be hundreds of them.
Frederick Graham, the caretaker, testified to this inquest, just as he had told the newspapers, that he had seen the swing door fully open, inwards, against the wall, when he last passed it, at about 4 o'clock. He also stated that the bolt was rather stiff. It might fall into the socket without being placed, but I have never known it to do so.
Question 1. Upon whom rested the legal duty or responsibility of taking proper precautions for the preservation of the lives of the children whilst within and on leaving the Victoria Hall? Did this responsibility devolve on the proprietor of the hall, his agent, or caretaker, or on Fay, or Coates, or either of them? Answer: Fay and Coates. Question 2. What was the particular neglect of duty, if any, which led to the loss of the children's lives? Was it in omitting to provide a sufficient staff of attendants to keep order within the gallery and on the staircase during the departure of the children? Answer: it was. Question 3. Was the staff provided sufficient for the purpose if the fatal door had not existed? Answer: no. Question 4. Was the caretaker's omission to inform Fay and his assistants of the existence of that door a neglect of duty? Answer: yes. Question 5. Was his further omission to reverse the position of the door and bolt it securely to the floor against the wall on the outer side of the landing? Although he passed it twice during the performance, the last time about 4 p.m., a further neglect of duty? Answer: yes. Question 6. Were the directors of the Victoria Hall Company Limited justified in erecting such an unusual door with such peculiar fastenings in such an unusual position without instructing the caretaker to call the special attention of strangers taking the hall to that door and its fastenings? Answer: no.
There was one other life affected by the tragedy. Robert Alexander Briggs was 15 at the time of the Victoria Hall disaster and living in Sunderland. 8 years later, the young engineer patented the design for a bolt which would keep the door secure against anyone trying to get in from outside, but ensure that those inside could always get out. In other words, the first version of the crash bar or push bar that we see on emergency exits today. The patent was applied for on the 2nd of November 1891 and was accepted on the 13th of August 1892. It was named Improvement in Bolts and Fastenings for Doors of Theatres and Other Public Buildings. Sadly, it would not be adopted quickly enough to prevent the large loss of life at a theatre in Chicago in 1903 or the Collinwood School Fire in Cleveland, 1908. However, since its adoption, it has no doubt saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. During the Second World War, in the early hours on the 16th of April 1941 at around 3 a.m. during a heavy air raid on the town, a German parachute mine scored a direct hit on the northern end of the building and completely demolished it. Sadly, several other nearby buildings were seriously damaged too, including the Winter Gardens and the Museum and Library in Mowbray Park and the Palatine Hotel at the northern end of Toward Road. Until then, the hall had stood for another 58 years. This beautiful, large and Gothic building that once stood proudly alongside the town's park had met its end. Many people never forgave the hall for the tragedy it was associated with and were relieved it had finally met its end. Perhaps one of the saddest reminders of that single day in June 1883 is one particular toy. It was one of the prizes that were handed out to the children that day. Amazingly, it has survived the long journey to the present day, although not without its suffering since the day it was presented to Emily Steele, aged 5 at the time. Emily received her promised toy, a small rocking horse which was immediately grabbed by a young boy who managed to pull off the forelegs and cradle in the attempt. Emily was left with the remainder, and fortunately escaped unharmed. The toy, which now resides at the Sunderland Museum and Winter Gardens, has currently been removed from display and is in storage at the museum. As the hall itself was demolished after the bomb blast that destroyed it in 1941, this iconic toy is perhaps one of the last sad reminders of that day, and hopefully will be preserved for future generations as they learn about the Victoria Hall disaster and what became one of the most tragic fatalities that took so many children, far too early and in the most horrific way possible. The Sunderland of today is a very much changed place, although if you could transport back to the late 1800s, chances are you would be able to navigate your way around the town. All the familiar streets and landmarks like Mowbray Park and Fawcett Street would be evident. Sunderland officially received city status in 1992, when Her Majesty the Queen granted it to mark the 40th anniversary of her accession to the throne. The city's status was granted after a competition held for the occasion, and the official confirmation documents known as the Letters Patent were received in May 1992. A long time has passed since the Victoria Hall stood majestically on that plot of land adjacent to Mowbray Park, but the tragedy still remains and the story still needs to be told. The needless deaths of so many little ones who only set out to be entertained on that fateful day is something we must always remember. We must also remember the families who suffered in the intervening years, also the survivors who were left traumatized by what they witnessed. Frederick Graham, the caretaker who resided at the hall with his young family, left soon after the tragedy, unable to continue. It deeply affected him as it did so many others. The moment that bolt was placed in the floor, it would seal the fate of so many children, causing a tragic chain of events.
Even if it's gonna break me, Lord, gonna make my way to you. Anyway, it's gonna take me, Lord, I run to you, I run to you. Cause you'll be safe in these arms of mine. Just call my name on the edge of the night. I'll run to you. I'll run to you. Even if it's gonna break me, Lord, I run to you.